Welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. Over the last couple of weeks, we have been exploring the various ethical issues that arise in research contexts. So, 2 weeks ago, we kicked off this discussion by looking at the ethical frameworks that informed animal care and use in research contexts. And we had three different positions, with Peter Singer's utilitarian position, Bernie Rollins' welfare focused position, and Tom Reagan's rights based position. And we talked about which of these various ethics should guide animal use today. And we also talked about the 3 R's and the pillars of animal welfare. Then last week, we looked at human subjects research, and in particular, we grappled with the question of what makes human subjects research ethical. And Emmanuel et al. Argued that informed consent is not enough, that we need 6 other criteria in order to ensure that human subjects research is both ethical and just, because we are putting humans at risk when we are testing the safety of various medical procedures or developing new standards of care or ensuring that new pharmaceutical products are safe, etc. And today we're going to be turning our attention to another contentious issue in biomedical ethics. Dare I say, probably the most contentious issue today, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade last year. So we'll be looking at the ethics of reproduction over the next couple of weeks, and we'll be jumping right into the deep end this week by looking at the ethical arguments employed in the abortion debate. So class today will be structured as follows. We'll be defining our terms as good bioethicists, and we'll be looking at the historical views concerning abortion, and we will go over the current public perceptions of abortion, and then we'll be ending with a case study. So what is ethics of reproduction? Well, very quickly, as all of you could have surmised from the term, its reproductive ethics is concerned with the ethics surrounding human reproduction and beginning of life issues. So contraception, whether or not we have access to contraception, is there a right to access to contraception? Do we have sex education, for example? What type of sex education should individuals have access to? These all fall under the umbrella of ethics of reproduction. Then we have assisted reproductive technologies or arts, and we will be discussing some of these next week. And these include in vitro fertilization and surrogacy. And then we have discussions concerning medical procedures in that specifically impact reproduction, beginning of life issues, and of course, questions concerning the termination of pregnancies. So there's a lot of really interesting topics going on in the ethics of reproduction today. In fact, my favorite is the designer baby debate. Should we be modifying our youth? Who should determine what traits we should be selecting for, if any? What about access to these types of assisted reproductive technologies? Are there barriers to access? Are the benefits and harms being distributed equally across groups and communities? And so all of these questions arise, as we'll see, throughout the weeks when we're looking at these topics. Now, I do want to note that, as I said, this is a very contentious issue. It's been a contentious issue for over 40 years, but with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we've been having lots of community and political discussions surrounding access to abortion. And so, because it's so contentious and polarized, please remember to be civil to your fellow students. Remember, in bioethics, we weigh the strengths and weaknesses of arguments, and we don't attack the person. So when you're writing in your discussion forum posts and when you're discussing these issues with others, please be cognizant and aware of that. We are all bioethicists and we're in this together, and so we should be try to be very supportive or at least respectful of your fellow bioethicists. And so, what is abortion? Well, abortion is the deliberate termination of a human pregnancy. And there are two types of abortion there's induced abortion, and this is the intentional termination of a pregnancy through drugs or surgery. And there's therapeutic abortion. And this type of abortion is performed specifically to preserve the life or health of the mother. So most late-term abortions are therapeutic abortions. They are specifically done because it is a health emergency. But therapeutic abortions can occur throughout in each stage of the pregnancy as well. And then there's another term that is often discussed when we're discussing abortions, and that is miscarriage. A miscarriage is the termination of a pregnancy due to natural causes outside of the control of the gestating parent. And so miscarriages fall outside of the abortion definition, although, as we'll see in recent debates throughout the last couple of years, which I thought was interesting, miscarriages can sometimes be mischaracterized as a type of abortion. And that can lead to some contentious discussions concerning policy. And so we want to make sure that these are distinct, that we have induced abortion, therapeutic abortions, and then we have miscarriages as a separate category. Now, we have been discussing whether or not the termination of pregnancies are ethical for a very long time. So, for as long as biomedical ethics has been a field of study, with the Hippocratic Oath and Hippocrates arguing that we need a professional ethic for medical professionals and practitioners, we have been talking about abortion. And so, of course, the Greeks have written about their views on the termination of a pregnancy. So today, it's one of the most contentious issues, but it's been a contentious issue for a long time. So even Aristotle, an old school philosopher writing in the BCEs over 2,000 years ago, spilled some ink on abortion, or at least chiseled some. No, I'm kidding. So he argued, let there be a law that no deformed child shall live. And he also famously wrote, if couples have children in excess, let abortion be procured before life and sense has begun. And so Aristotle was supportive of the termination of pregnancies for family planning purposes. And he also had some very problematic views, as we'll see, on disability. Now, the Hippocratic Oath has a passage or two about the termination of pregnancy, and the Hippocratic Oath historically prescribed the use of substances to induce abortion, so it wasn't seen as a violation of the principle of harm. However, since the Greeks, there are many other traditions that take different views on abortion. And here with Aristotle, personhood wasn't seen as, you weren't seen as a person until you were born. And so it was seen as an acceptable practice. Although, as we'll see, and I want to turn to the next slide, what is a person and when personhood begins plays a major role not only in historical debates, as we'll look at, but also in future debates. And so for the Greeks, personhood didn't begin until we took in our first breath. But we have different views concerning personhood today. And so fast forward to the Middle Ages, and we have various Christian sects, just to use this as an example, holding conflicting views on abortion, again coming down on what is a person and when does personhood begin. So the contemporary view is that unborn children are human beings from the moment of conception. However, this is a view that wasn't accepted until after the 1300s. So we have Thomas Aquinas arguing he was born in 1225 and died in 1274, so the 1200s. He also wrote about the ethics of abortion, and he gave us an argument. He argued that the unborn child cannot have a soul until they are formed or takes on a human shape. So that's 40 days for boys and 90 days for girls. Don't understand how they came up with that calculation. Thus, killing a fetus, though always sinful, is not murder until after this point. And so here, the view was that personhood didn't begin at conception, but began at quickening at 40 days or 90 days. And so that's when the ethical importance of the act sort of came to a head, so to speak. So in 1312, this became the Catholic Church's official position, although, as we know today, the Catholic Church tends to focus on conception as the moment of personhood. And on Wednesday, we'll be looking at the various interesting ways that personhood influences our contemporary debate as well. So we have the Greeks, and they're like, personhood begins at birth, and so the termination of a pregnancy is acceptable. Then we have the Christian tradition, and you can see as we're gaining a better understanding of what's occurring in pregnancies, we have Thomas Aquinas arguing that personhood begins at 40 days or 90 days, and then we have the current view concerning conception. Now, fast forward to the 17 and 1800s, and we have English common law. And we're looking at English common law because this greatly influenced U.S. positions during this time period. So for English common law, abortion is a crime only if committed after quickening. And so quickening is when you can feel the child moving in the womb. And so it's when the child can kick or, squirm around and whatnot, In fact, my sister-in-law would always talk about how her youngest was such a kicker, and that was definitely after quickening. And so U.S. law largely followed this position through the 19th century. And so we have views that after quickening, this is when personhood begins, and so this is sort of the cutoff period when an abortion is acceptable. However, over the next 100 years, from the 1900s to the 2000s, we saw ever stricter abortion laws being placed on the books, to the point where by the 1950s, only those abortions that preserve the health of the mother or therapeutic abortions were considered acceptable in the context of the United States. Now, fast forward, that's up to the 1940s. By the 1950s, there was a push for less severe abortion policies. And by 1970, the American Medical Association supported the legal shift, as it respects patients' autonomy. So remember, we saw a shift from paternalism, or this top-down view, to embracing the bedrock principle of modern bioethics, which is respecting the autonomy of patients. And so the American Medical Association shifted their positions from very strict views concerning the termination of pregnancy towards a position where autonomy was prioritized. Now, I just wanted to take a moment. Here's my cat, Max. Max loves to do yoga in the park. You can see he's stretching his little ham hocks there. And I know this is a contentious topic, so I thought, we would just take a Max break. So fast forward after Max is like, ah. So we have 1970, and we have less strict views concerning the termination of a pregnancy. And then we fast forward to 1973, and we have the seminal case of Roe v. Wade. And so hopefully this video will play, but I do want to discuss the history of Roe v. Wade because it was contentious even in the year within which it passed, and then it set off discussions from the 70s up to, 2023? And so over 50 years of debates post Roe v. Wade, as we'll see. And so let's set the stage. Hopefully it will play. There we go. I'll also post this too.
Mr. Beat presents Supreme Court Briefs. Dallas, Texas, 1969. A young woman named Norma McCorvey was single, pregnant, and scared about her future. She wanted an abortion, but in Texas, abortions were illegal, except in cases in which the mother's life was in danger. McCorvey had planned on having one anyway at an illegal clinic. However, police shut down that clinic. Desperate, Norma soon found out that 2 lawyers were looking for women who were seeking abortions in order to fight the Texas law that banned them. They promised pizza and beer, so Norma came. The lawyers, Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, decided to take Norma's case over several others. The 2 were not much older than Norma. On March 3rd, 1970, Coffey officially filed a complaint at the Dallas Federal District Courthouse, giving Norma a pseudonym, Jane Roe, to protect her identity. They were suing the state of Texas, arguing its abortion law was unconstitutional. Defending the state of Texas was Henry Wade, the district attorney of Dallas. By this time, Norma was 6 months pregnant. The district court looked at Norma's case along with 2 other related cases. On June 17, 1970, the 3-judge panel of the court unanimously called the Texas abortion law unconstitutional, saying it broke the right to privacy assumed under the 9th Amendment. However, they did not act to stop enforcement of the law. The defense appealed the ruling and it went to the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, Norma had given birth to the baby she had originally thought about killing and put the baby up for adoption. The case sat for a year and a half. Finally, on December 13, 1971, the Supreme Court heard arguments. In his opening argument, defense attorney Jay Floyd made a bad joke that probably hurt his case. Going against Weddington and Coffey, he said, quote, "It's an old joke, but when a man argues against 2 beautiful ladies like this, they are going to have the last word," unquote. The joke was not well received. The entire courtroom was silent, and Chief Justice Warren Burger gave him a cold glare. Regardless, by the end of the arguments, all of those justices agreed that Texas law was bad, but for different reasons. But the case sat some more because 2 justices, Hugo Black and John Harlan, had recently retired and were not yet replaced. In January, Lewis F. Powell and William Rehnquist joined the court, but it wasn't until October of 1972 that they heard arguments again. The court announced their decision on January 22, 1973. With a 7-2 majority vote, they went in favor of Roe, arguing that abortion fell under the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. Again, it came down to a right to privacy. Basically, the court ruled a woman had the right to an abortion until the fetus reached an age of viability. Viability means that the baby would be able to survive independently outside of the mother's womb. Well, back then, doctors believed this to be around the 28th week of pregnancy. Today, thanks to the wonders of technology, that's around the 22nd week of pregnancy. The two justices who disagreed with the decision were Byron White and William Rehnquist, one of the new dudes on the court. White argued the court was just making up a new constitutional right and didn't have the authority to do so. Rehnquist argued the other justices were expanding the 14th Amendment to mean something much more than its original authors intended. Regardless, the decision essentially legalized abortion and declared many state laws unconstitutional because of this. Before the Roe v. Wade decision, 30 states had outlawed abortion, and the other states restricted it in at least some way. Roe v. Wade sparked a contentious debate that continues to this day. On one side, supporters of the Roe v. Wade decision are often called pro-choice, meaning it should be the woman's choice whether she wants the abortion or not. Opponents of the Roe v. Wade decision are often called pro-life. They argue that because life begins at conception, any abortion should be regarded as murder. The abortion issue has become even more divisive in recent years. In fact, many people vote for politicians simply based on whether they are pro-life or not. So whatever happened to Norma McCorvey? Well, in a 1984 interview, she revealed herself as Roe for the first time and became a pro-choice advocate, even volunteering at a women's clinic. At first, she went around telling the press that she wanted the abortion because she was raped. However, she later said that this was a lie. She had made it up. Norma published an autobiography in 1994 called I Am Roe. Soon after this, in a surprising turn of events, she quit her job at the abortion clinic and became pro-life. She became a born-again Christian and immediately joined the staff of Operation Rescue, a pro-life organization at an office literally next door to the abortion clinic she formerly worked at. She was a pro-life activist for the rest of her life. By the way, Norma never met the baby that started this whole thing. That baby presumably grew up and is somewhere out there right now, and he or she is 46 years old.
All right, so as we see, 1973, we have the Supreme Court case, Roe v. Wade, and that overturned many state regulations concerning abortion, making it accessible in all 50 states. Now, Roe v. Wade in 1973, as we march ever closer to 2023, there are various other court rulings that limited the applicability of Roe v. Wade. And so the court ruling was circumscribed by other decisions, such as Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which required that a woman can be required to give her written informed consent to an abortion. The government is not obliged to use taxpayer money to fund abortion services. Parental consent or a judge's authorization can be determined or demanded of minors, and a state can forbid the use of public facilities to perform abortions. Then fast forward to the Dobbs decision, and R v. Wade was overturned, and so the question now has been kicked from the federal level back to the states. And so as we see, as this has been unfolding, various states have passed various pieces of legislation, either expanding access to abortions or greatly restricting them, as we'll see. So Texas, for example, is one that passed some very restrictive regulations. Ohio is another one. There was a debate in Kansas about what acceptable access looked like. And so each state is determining what is essentially grappling with the question of whether terminating a pregnancy is acceptable, and the particulars of that, at how many weeks, etc. Are therapeutic abortions acceptable, or are they not? And so the debate has been wide-ranging in all 50 states, very contentious, with supporters on both sides. And so, as we begin to kick the tires and discuss the ethics of terminating a pregnancy, let's look at some of the facts to sort of set the stage for our discussion. So, the span of a pregnancy is calculated from the first day of the woman's last menstrual period and is usually divided into 3 parts. And so we have the first trimester, that's 0 to 12 weeks. And there the fetus takes on rudimentary human shape, internal organs, the brain and the spine begin to form. 90% of all abortions that were currently performed or that are currently performed are done during the first trimester. And so this is the time period when most terminations occur. Then we have the second trimester, which is from 13 to 24 weeks. And here you can determine the sex of the baby. Quickening occurs. And so with the common law, for example, that term quickening, this is when the baby begins to move. And this all occurs between 13 and 24 weeks. And then we have the third trimester, which is 25 to 40 weeks. And viability is achieved at 23 weeks, although these facts are a little dated. I believe we're at 21 to 22 weeks now for viability. And it should be noted that 1% of all abortions occur during the third trimester. And these are virtually all therapeutic abortions because the mother's or the gestational parent's health is in danger. So we have first trimester, second trimester, and third trimester. Now, just some facts. Today, half of all pregnancies are unintended in the United States, and 21% of all unintended pregnancies end in abortion. So that is a large amount of aborted pregnancies. In 2011, 1.06 million abortions were performed. Less than 5% of women having a first trimester abortion suffer major complications. Women in their 20s were responsible for over 50% of all abortions, and one-fifth of these abortions were performed on women who are teenagers. And so that's a typo. So women in their 20s are younger, and one-fifth of abortions in this category were performed on women who are teenagers. So I need to correct that. Women who have one or more children account for 61% of abortions. And so as you'll see in the Dateline documentary, where they talked with a few couples seeking to terminate a pregnancy, abortion services is seen as a family planning tool in that context. Now, reasons that are often given for abortions include, from most common to least common, having a baby would change my life. It's one of the most common reasons. I can't afford a baby now. I don't want to be a single mother, or I'm having relationship problems. I already completed my childbearing, and so I have, the children I want. My partner wants me to have an abortion. There are problems impacting the health of the fetus. There are physical problems with my health. I was a victim of rape, or I became pregnant due to incest. Now, the public, and I find this absolutely fascinating, the public both disagrees and agrees on several aspects of abortion. So here's some statistics pulled from a large-scale study in the United States. And so when the participants were asked whether or not abortion should be legal, 29% argued that it should always be legal. 51% argued that it should sometimes be legal. It depends on the context, right? Are we talking about induced or therapeutic abortions? Like what type of abortion? Was incest or rape involved, etc.? and 19% argued that it should always be illegal. And so that's a very, like, we have 51% in the gray category, with 29% always legal and 19% always illegal. So there's overlap there. Roughly, the United States population is right down the middle with whether or not they were pro-choice or pro-life, with 50% self-identifying as pro-choice and 44% of the survey takers stating that they're pro-life and 6% stating that they did not want to say. And so there's no wonder that this is a contentious issue, right? The US population is very much split. And then we have concerning the ethical question about whether or not terminating a pregnancy is ethical or unethical. 45% of survey takers argued that it's always morally wrong, and 45% argued that it's morally acceptable, with 10% of the population not wanting to answer. And so we have a split here. We have overlap concerning the legality, with the majority of people arguing, let's look at the contexts, but the always legal and the always illegal sides are pretty balanced, right? Pro-choice and pro-life were split right down the middle, and then the question of the ethical question also, we are split right down the middle. And so this is a recipe for having some very difficult discussions around the Thanksgiving table, right? Or any other holiday when you're meeting with family. You're probably going to have various family members who identify in different ways on this issues. And people feel very strongly about this as well, as you can see from the small percentage of people who decided not to reply. And so we only have 6% of survey takers not stating whether they are clearly pro-choice or pro-life. And we only have 10% of survey takers opting out of answering the ethical question. And you would think that more would be like, I don't know if I want to, like, I have to think about the ethical question. But no, here, like, people clearly know where they stand on this issue. So I find these numbers to be very telling of the debate that we're having today, and very interesting. And so, how we determine personhood, as we saw from the historical arguments, be that Aristotle, be that Thomas Aquinas, be that quickening with common law, how we determine personhood is at the center of ethical debates on abortion. And so, this is where we are going to pick up on Wednesday. Although, before we begin our discussion of abortion, because if we go back to, and I apologize for moving through all of these slides, if we go back to the abortion facts today, the fact that we have women in their 20s or under, or gestational parents in their 20s or under, being responsible for over 50% of all abortions, and 1/5 of these occurring in teenagers. Another question, questions that I want to begin our discussion with, are questions of sex education and contraception, because this seems like this is an important first step before discussing the abortion debate. So I have a video on sex ed. I'll play that, but I'm also going to post it. And I would like us to discuss the following questions then. What did your sex education program look like? And if you weigh the merits and weaknesses of each type of sex education, which would you endorse? And if you apply the biomedical principles here, do we have an ethical duty to provide sex education? And imagine you're a member of the American Medical Association Committee outlining recommendations for effective sex ed. what would those be and why? And so I'd like to watch this video, and then on Wednesday, we are going to jump into that personhood debate. We're going to be looking at various arguments made by supporters by pro-choice and by pro-life positions. And it is a tennis match. There are critiques and counter arguments and critiques and counter arguments. And I would love to see where you stand. Which position do you think is the correct one that we should have? This is one of my, dare I say, one of my favorite debates, just because it is so interesting to see how these various ethical positions are used to defend the different positions. As a bioethicist, I'm always interested in how ethical frameworks are used and employed. Right.
I'll bet you didn't know that in the 70s, high school sex education was arguably more progressive than it is today. Yeah. Sex ed is so limited in today's schools, in fact, that 28 states don't even require it to be taught. And only 13 states require that sex ed instruction be medically accurate, mostly meaning that it should be accurate about the effectiveness of condoms. And with teen pregnancy and STI rates in the US substantially higher than in other developed countries, maybe it's time for a sex ed revolution. But just how did sex ed in the US get so bad in the first place? Well, the first sex ed curriculum, called sex hygiene classes, was introduced in 1913 in Chicago by a woman named Ella Flagg Young, who was also the first female superintendent of schools in the city. Unfortunately for Young and her students, the Catholic Church didn't like this very much and put an end to her program after only 1 year. It wasn't until the US entered World War I that the government realized it had a major problem, or rather, its troops did. The Army lost a total of 7 million working days from soldiers suffering from STIs, which back then was called VD, or venereal disease. And a total of 10,000 soldiers were discharged for having them. The White House concluded that so many American soldiers wouldn't have contracted STIs had they been better educated about sex. In the 20s, upwards of 40% of American public schools started teaching sex ed, which coincidentally developed just as the film industry was taking off. As Hollywood boomed, so did sex ed films. Then in the 30s, the U.S. Office of Education began publishing materials and training teachers on how to teach sex ed.
We must continue this important work of education and forget our prudish attitude towards sex.
Then in 1944, at the height of World War II, came the mass production of penicillin, saving troops everywhere suffering from STIs. Fast forward 16 years when the FDA approved the pill in 1960 for widespread use. It was the beginning of the sexual revolution. Of course, Americans' newfound sexuality didn't come without backlash. In 1968, a pamphlet called "Is the Schoolhouse the Proper Place to Teach Raw Sex?" started appearing in public schools.
This moral decay weakens our resistance to the onslaught of the communist masters of deceit.
And yet, 1970s curriculum featured some of the most explicit films found in sex ed classes, ones they wouldn't likely show in today's classrooms.
Many different kinds of feelings can cause an erection.
But by the late 70s, the conservative right started influencing some parents to protest the curriculum. And then in 1981, the Reagan administration introduced the Adolescent Family Life Act. This law, which put a ton of funding towards sex ed programs that promoted abstinence, was the single biggest influencer on modern-day sex ed curriculum. But research showed that abstinence-only programs that gained popularity in the 80s and 90s didn't work. Teens still had just as much sex, and states with abstinence-only education had the highest rates of teen pregnancies. In fact, a 2008 study reported that teens who received comprehensive sex education were 60% less likely to get pregnant than those who received abstinence-only education. So in 2010, Obama cut funding for abstinence-only programs by 2/3. And for the first time ever, the government began funding comprehensive sex ed programs. You know, ones that actually talked about contraception. Today, both abstinence-only sex ed and more comprehensive sex ed are equally funded by the government. But with only 18 states and the District of Columbia requiring those kinds of comprehensive classes, is it time to teach all students what they really need to know about sex? So you want to go to...
All right. All right. So I am looking forward to the discussions ahead. I think that we should definitely begin our discussions of ethics of reproduction by looking at sex education and access and the different types of sex ed and which you think is the correct or best type of sex ed to have in schools. And then on Wednesday, we are going to jump in, as I said, to look at the nuts and the bolts of the abortion debate as it is currently. And so remember, this is a contentious issue, so please be respectful of your fellow students. But I am looking forward to the discussion ahead. And so I will see you then.